Hey guys, imagine leaving everything familiar behind. Your home, your neighbors, your life, and stepping onto a path that stretches for thousands of miles. The Oregon Trail was not a simple journey. It was long, grueling, and full of uncertainty. Families traveled together in covered wagons, facing blazing sun, freezing nights, unpredictable rivers, and endless plains that seemed to go on forever. Food was scarce, oxen grew weary, and sickness lurked at every turn. Each day brought the slow rhythm of survival, where patience, resilience, and careful planning mattered more than courage or luck. Yet, amid the hardship, there were moments of quiet wonder. The vast skies, the song of the wind, the gentle flow of rivers, and the untamed beauty of the land that promised a new life. This is the story of what it was really like to live on the Oregon Trail, to endure its challenges, and to keep moving forward, one day at a time, toward the hope of a brighter future. Long before the wheels of wagons carved their familiar tracks across the American plains, the land between the Missouri River and the distant valleys of the Pacific Northwest stretched outward in a vast and mostly unbroken expanse. Grasslands rolled across the horizon like a quiet ocean, rising and falling in gentle waves beneath wide skies. Rivers wound through these open spaces, carving shallow valleys where cottonwood trees gathered along their banks. In the far distance, blue shapes of mountains waited beneath drifting clouds. For countless generations, this immense landscape had been home to indigenous nations who understood its rhythms intimately. They followed the migrations of bison, traveled seasonal routes between hunting grounds, and developed knowledge of rivers, weather patterns, and hidden passes through rugged terrain. Trails already existed across the plains long before the arrival of wagons. These paths had been worn by footsteps, horses, and centuries of travel. During the early decades of the 19th century, however, new travelers began appearing along the western edge of the American frontier. They arrived first in small numbers: trappers, explorers, missionaries, and traders. These early visitors moved cautiously through unfamiliar territory, recording the rivers they crossed and the mountains they struggled to pass. Their journals described a route that would soon become one of the most famous migration corridors in American history. It would later be called the Oregon Trail. The journey that lay along this route stretched for more than 2,000 miles. It began near the Missouri River in towns that stood at the very edge of American settlement. From there, the trail crossed the rolling prairies of present-day Kansas and Nebraska, followed the broad valley of the Platte River, climbed through the Rocky Mountains, and eventually descended into the fertile valleys of the Pacific Northwest. For families preparing to undertake this journey during the 1840s and 1850s, the decision rarely came suddenly. Months or even years of thought often preceded the moment when a household committed itself to leaving everything familiar behind. The idea of Oregon carried a powerful attraction. Stories circulated throughout frontier communities describing a region of deep forests, fertile soil, and mild climate. Reports from missionaries and early settlers spoke of farmland where crops grew abundantly, without the harsh droughts that sometimes troubled the plains farther east. Maps of the time offered only partial understanding of the land, yet the promise of opportunity seemed real enough to inspire thousands to attempt the journey. Families preparing for the migration faced an enormous logistical challenge. Nearly every possession needed to be considered carefully, because the weight of supplies would determine whether a wagon could complete the long journey west. Large furniture, heavy tools, and many household items had to be left behind. Only the most necessary equipment could be carried. Wagons chosen for the trip were rarely the large covered vehicles often depicted in later paintings. Most migrants traveled in smaller farm wagons that had been modified for the journey. Wooden bows were attached along the wagon bed, supporting stretched canvas that formed a curved covering overhead. This design offered modest protection from rain and sun while keeping the structure relatively lightweight. The wagons were usually pulled by teams of oxen rather than horses. Oxen moved slowly but possessed remarkable endurance. They required less specialized care, could graze on prairie grasses along the route, and handled heavy loads more reliably during long days of travel. Each wagon became a carefully balanced system of supplies. Barrels of flour formed the foundation of many provisions. Flour could be baked into bread, thickened into stews, or cooked as simple biscuits over campfires. Alongside the flour traveled sacks of beans, dried fruit, rice, coffee, and salt. Preserved meats were packed whenever possible, though they rarely lasted the entire journey. Cooking equipment remained simple. Iron pots, tin plates, and a few basic utensils provided the tools necessary to prepare meals along the trail. Clothing also required careful planning. Garments had to withstand months of constant wear, exposure to dust, and unpredictable weather conditions. Wool, linen, and sturdy cotton fabrics formed the core of most travel wardrobes. In addition to personal supplies, wagons carried spare parts and tools needed to repair equipment during the journey. Axes, hammers, rope, wheel grease, and wooden planks might prove essential when something inevitably broke far from any settlement. Every inch of space inside the wagon mattered. Despite these careful preparations, most travelers understood that life along the trail would require constant adaptation. When spring arrived and the rivers began swelling with melted snow from the mountains, the first wagon trains gathered near departure towns along the Missouri frontier. Places such as Independence, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs became centers of intense activity during these months. Blacksmith shops rang with the sound of hammers shaping metal fittings. General stores filled their shelves with supplies destined for the long journey west. Livestock crowded the outskirts of town as migrants purchased oxen and mules. Wagons were loaded, weighed, rearranged, and loaded again as families attempted to achieve the delicate balance between necessity and excess. The day of departure rarely arrived with dramatic ceremony. Instead, wagons rolled quietly out of town one by one, joining loose collections of travelers heading toward the same distant goal. A single wagon seldom traveled alone for long. Within a few days, groups began forming naturally along the trail. Families shared campsites, exchanged advice, and gradually organized themselves into larger wagon trains that offered mutual support. These groups might contain 20 wagons or sometimes more than 100, depending on the time of year and the number of migrants traveling the route. Leadership within a wagon train often developed through experience rather than formal authority. Individuals who had traveled portions of the trail before were respected for their knowledge of the route, water sources, and river crossings. Their guidance helped shape daily routines that soon became familiar. Each morning began early, often before the sun had fully risen above the prairie horizon. Campfires were stirred back to life, and simple breakfasts were prepared while livestock were gathered from nearby grazing areas. Oxen were yoked carefully into their wooden harnesses. By mid-morning, the wagons began rolling once again, forming a slow procession that stretched across the open land. The pace remained steady but unhurried. Oxen moved at roughly 2 miles per hour, which meant the wagon train might cover 15 or 20 miles during a full day of travel if conditions remained favorable. Dust rose behind the wheels as they passed across dry ground. On windy days, the dust drifted far across the plains, creating pale clouds that followed the travelers for miles. Despite the steady movement, most people spent the majority of the day walking beside the wagons rather than riding inside them. The interior space was crowded with supplies, leaving little room for passengers. Walking also reduced the burden on the oxen and allowed travelers to stretch their legs after long hours on uneven ground. Children sometimes rode atop the wagon seats or perched along the edges of the canvas covers, watching the landscape change slowly around them. At midday, the train paused briefly. Oxen were allowed to rest while travelers prepared a simple meal, often bread, dried meat, or beans warmed over small fires. These stops rarely lasted long. The long distance ahead encouraged steady progress whenever daylight remained. During the afternoon hours, the sun climbed high above the prairie. Heat shimmered above the grasslands, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Occasionally, the trail passed through shallow river valleys where water and shade offered welcome relief. Cottonwood trees rustled quietly along the banks, and wildlife sometimes appeared at a distance. Antelope moving swiftly across the plains or bison grazing in scattered herds. By evening, the wagon train slowed as a suitable campsite was chosen. The wagons were often arranged in a loose circle or rectangle, creating an open space in the center where livestock could be gathered during the night. This arrangement provided some protection from wandering animals and helped keep the oxen from drifting too far into the darkness. Fires flickered across the camp as supper was prepared. The long day of walking left many travelers tired, yet the calm atmosphere of the prairie evening often brought a quiet sense of accomplishment. Above the open plains, the sky expanded into a vast canopy filled with stars. Far from the growing cities of the eastern United States, the night sky revealed remarkable clarity. Constellations appeared sharp and bright, stretching from horizon to horizon above the silent wagons. Within this peaceful setting, families rested beside the vehicles that carried their entire world westward. The journey had only just begun. Ahead lay thousands of miles of rivers, plains, mountains, and deserts, each presenting its own challenges and discoveries. And with every passing day, the Oregon Trail would reveal the realities of life lived between hope and uncertainty on the long road west. Morning light gradually spread across the prairie, revealing the quiet shapes of wagons resting in a wide circle upon the grass. Thin columns of smoke drifted upward from campfires that had been rekindled before dawn. The air carried a cool stillness that often lingered during the early hours before the sun rose high enough to warm the plains. Travelers began their day with practiced routine. Blankets were folded, cooking pots rinsed, and provisions repacked inside the wagons. Oxen grazed nearby through the night, and gathering them each morning became one of the first tasks of the day. Animals wandered farther than expected if left unattended, and locating them sometimes required long walks across the surrounding grasslands. Once the oxen were found, they were guided back toward camp and fitted into their wooden yokes. These simple devices rested across the animal's shoulders and allowed two oxen to pull together as a team. Several pairs could be attached to a single wagon, depending on the weight of the load and the strength of the animals. When everything was ready, the wagons began moving once more. The trail during these early stages followed the valleys of rivers that flowed gently eastward across the plains. Water served as the most reliable guide through an otherwise immense landscape. For the Oregon Trail, one of the most important rivers was the Platte. The Platte River stretched wide and shallow across the Nebraska Territory, often appearing more like a braided network of channels than a single flowing stream. Sandbars divided the water into shifting paths that glimmered beneath the sun. Travelers soon discovered that the river offered both advantage and difficulty. Its valley provided relatively level ground, making the journey easier for wagons pulled by oxen. At the same time, the riverbanks contained soft sand that could trap wheels if wagons strayed too far from the firm sections of the trail. Day after day, the wagon trains followed the Platte westward. The river's steady presence gave travelers a sense of direction across the otherwise featureless plains. Grasslands stretched outward on both sides of the valley, sometimes extending farther than the eye could see. The prairie changed subtly as the journey progressed. In some places, the grass grew tall and thick, brushing against the legs of travelers walking beside the wagons. In other areas, the vegetation appeared shorter and more sparse, shaped by wind and weather. Wildlife remained a constant presence across this open land. Herds of bison occasionally appeared in the distance, moving slowly across the plains like dark waves rolling through the grass. Their numbers were far greater during the early years of migration than they would be later in the century. Antelope moved swiftly across the open ground, their pale coats blending with the dry grass as they watched the passing wagons from a safe distance. Birds also filled the sky above the trail. Hawks circled high overhead, scanning the ground for movement. Smaller birds fluttered among the grasses and riverbanks, their calls drifting across the quiet prairie. For many travelers, these scenes offered moments of wonder during the long journey. Yet life along the trail rarely felt leisurely. Dust became one of the most persistent companions of the migration. As wagons rolled across dry ground, their wheels crushed the soil into fine powder that rose into the air behind them. When dozens of wagons traveled together, the dust clouds could grow thick enough to obscure the trail entirely. Travelers walking near the rear of the train sometimes found themselves moving through a haze that coated their clothing, hair, and faces. The dust settled everywhere, inside wagons, within cooking pots, and even among carefully packed food supplies. Despite these inconveniences, the wagon trains continued forward with remarkable determination. Travel rarely followed a perfectly smooth path. Sections of the trail crossed low hills where the wagons creaked, and strained while climbing gradual slopes. At other times the route descended toward river crossings that demanded careful attention. Streams flowing into the Platte presented frequent obstacles. Some were shallow enough for wagons to pass through directly, with oxen stepping slowly across the water while wheels rolled over the rocky bottom. Other streams required more preparation. When water ran deeper or currents moved quickly, travelers sometimes unloaded their wagons before attempting the crossing. Supplies were carried across first, followed by the lighter wagons pulled carefully through the water. These crossings demanded patience and cooperation among the travelers. During such moments, the wagon train paused entirely while everyone worked together to ensure that each vehicle reached the opposite bank safely. Occasionally, mishaps occurred. Wheels slipped against unseen rocks, wagons tilted unexpectedly, or supplies became wet during the crossing. When this happened, the travelers simply adapted. Wet clothing was spread across bushes or wagon frames to dry in the sun. Damaged equipment was repaired using the spare tools carried for that purpose. Gradually, through persistence and shared effort, the wagon train resumed its steady progress westward. Another constant concern along the trail involved the health of both people and animals. The long journey demanded physical endurance from everyone involved. Travelers walked many miles each day beneath the open sky, exposed to changing weather conditions that ranged from intense heat to sudden storms. Blisters, sore muscles, and exhaustion became common experiences. Oxen faced their own challenges. Pulling heavy wagons across uneven terrain required enormous strength, and the animals needed regular rest and grazing time to maintain their energy. During evening camps, herds were often driven a short distance away from the wagons so they could feed on fresh grass. Guarding the animals during the night became an important responsibility. If oxen wandered too far or were startled by unfamiliar sounds, they could disappear into the darkness, delaying the entire wagon train the following morning. As the days passed along the Platte River Valley, certain landmarks began appearing along the horizon. One of the earliest and most recognizable features was a solitary rock formation rising above the surrounding plains. Travelers approaching from the east often noticed it long before reaching its base. This landmark would later become widely known as Chimney Rock. Its tall, narrow spire stood like a natural tower above the grasslands, visible from miles away across the open prairie. For migrants who had spent weeks traveling through landscapes that seemed nearly identical from day to day, the sight of this towering formation carried deep significance. It represented proof that progress was being made. Reaching such landmarks gave travelers a renewed sense of purpose as they continued westward. Beyond Chimney Rock, the trail passed other distinctive formations that gradually became familiar names in the stories of migration: Scott's Bluff, Courthouse Rock, and the distant ridges that hinted at the approaching mountains. These geological features broke the long horizon of the plains, offering orientation within the vast landscape. For children traveling within the wagon trains, such landmarks often became moments of excitement. The immense rock towers appeared almost mysterious against the sky, their shapes carved by wind and time over countless centuries. Meanwhile, daily life within the camps continued to follow a rhythm shaped by necessity. Evenings provided the briefest opportunity for rest and routine beyond walking. Meals remained simple but comforting after the long day's journey. Beans simmered slowly in iron pots, sometimes flavored with small portions of preserved meat when available. Bread or biscuits baked in Dutch ovens provided another staple of the trail diet. Coffee also became an important part of camp life. Prepared over open fires, the warm drink offered both comfort and energy to travelers who faced another day of walking when morning arrived. After supper, many people spent time performing small tasks that kept the wagon train functioning smoothly. Clothing required mending after constant use. Harness straps needed repair. Wheels were inspected to ensure that the iron rims remained secure and properly greased. Children sometimes gathered bits of dry wood for the following morning's fires, while others helped organize supplies inside the wagons. Once darkness settled across the prairie, the camp grew quiet. The wide sky above the plains revealed more stars than many travelers had ever seen before leaving the settled regions of the east. With no towns or cities nearby, the night air carried an extraordinary clarity. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a faint ribbon of light. Coyotes occasionally howled in the distance, their voices echoing across the open land. Yet for the most part, the prairie night remained calm. Families rested beneath the canvas covers of their wagons or beneath the open sky beside the campfires that slowly faded into glowing embers. While the wagon trains moved steadily westward, the journey along the Platte River Valley still represented only the beginning of a much longer path. Far beyond the horizon lay the Rocky Mountains, rising like a distant wall between the plains and the western valleys that migrants hoped to reach. For now, however, the travelers continued along the quiet river corridor, following the same route that thousands before them had begun to carve across the American continent. As the wagon trains moved farther west along the valley of the Platte, the character of the landscape began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The wide grasslands still stretched across the horizon, yet the terrain gradually lost some of its softness. The earth appeared drier in many places, and patches of pale soil replaced the darker ground that had marked the earlier portion of the journey. The Platte River itself slowly transformed as the travelers advanced upstream. What had once seemed like a broad and wandering ribbon of water began narrowing into channels that moved with slightly greater force. Sandbars still divided the current into separate streams, but the banks now revealed more exposed gravel and stone. These changes signaled that the migration had entered a new stage. The long approach toward the Rocky Mountains had begun. Although the mountains themselves remained far beyond the visible horizon, their presence could already be sensed in the geography of the land. Rivers ran more swiftly. Hills appeared more frequently along the trail. Winds sweeping across the plains carried a cooler edge, especially during the early hours of morning. For the migrants walking beside their wagons, each of these signs offered quiet evidence that the western frontier was drawing nearer. The wagon trains continued following the Platte for many weeks. Yet the river itself eventually divided into two separate branches. One of these branches flowed southward, while the other turned north. The Oregon Trail followed the northern route, a stream known as the North Platte River. This choice guided the travelers toward the narrow corridors that would eventually lead through the mountains. Along this stretch of the journey, the trail passed through regions that had already begun attracting small numbers of traders and settlers. Temporary trading posts appeared at certain points where supplies could be exchanged or purchased. These posts were often simple wooden structures built near river crossings or along well-used sections of the trail. Their presence offered travelers rare opportunities to obtain items that had been lost, broken, or exhausted during the earlier weeks of migration. Fresh livestock sometimes appeared for sale. Tools, ammunition, cloth, and basic provisions could occasionally be acquired, though often at higher prices due to the difficulty of transporting goods into such remote areas. For many migrants, these trading posts represented the last connection to established commerce before the journey entered more isolated regions. Nearby, clusters of indigenous encampments sometimes appeared along the riverbanks. These communities had long relied on the river valleys as travel routes and hunting grounds. Encounters between wagon trains and indigenous nations varied widely depending on location and circumstance. In some places, travelers exchanged small goods such as cloth, tobacco, or tools in return for assistance locating water or guiding wagons through unfamiliar terrain. In other cases, the two groups simply observed one another from a distance as they continued along their separate paths. The plains remained large enough to hold both presence and distance. Life within the wagon trains gradually adjusted to the realities of the long migration. By this stage, travelers had settled into routines that governed nearly every aspect of daily existence. Morning preparations grew faster and more efficient with practice. Tasks that once required careful planning now unfolded almost automatically. Fires were lit quickly, wagons packed with practiced movements, and oxen harnessed without hesitation. The steady rhythm of the trail shaped the passage of time. Each day followed a familiar pattern, walking beside the wagons through long stretches of prairie, pausing briefly at midday, then traveling again until the sun lowered toward the western sky. Yet despite this routine, the journey never felt entirely predictable. Weather across the plains could change without warning. One afternoon might bring calm sunlight and gentle breezes that carried the scent of dry grass across the open land. The following day could arrive beneath darkening clouds that rolled across the sky with growing speed. Thunderstorms sometimes swept over the prairie with dramatic intensity. Heavy rain fell in sudden bursts, turning sections of the trail into slippery mud. Lightning flashed across the sky while strong winds rattled the canvas coverings stretched over the wagons. During such storms, the wagon trains often halted temporarily until conditions improved. Traveling through thick mud could damage wheels or exhaust the oxen far more quickly than dry ground. Waiting for the earth to firm again became the safer choice. After the storm passed, the prairie often seemed transformed. The air carried a fresh coolness, and the grasses glistened with droplets that sparkled beneath the returning sunlight. Temporary streams appeared in shallow depressions where rainwater collected before slowly soaking back into the soil. Such moments offered brief relief from the dust that otherwise followed the wagon trains across the plains. Beyond the challenges of weather, another quiet transformation was unfolding within the migration itself. As weeks turned into months, relationships between the travelers deepened. Individuals who had begun the journey as strangers now relied on one another for daily survival. Work along the trail required cooperation. When wagons became stuck in soft ground, several teams of oxen might be brought together to pull the vehicle free. When equipment broke, tools and spare materials were often shared among neighboring wagons. Camp tasks also encouraged collaboration. One group might gather firewood while others prepared food or watched the livestock. Children frequently moved between wagons during the evening hours, forming friendships that brightened the long days of travel. In this environment, the wagon train gradually became something resembling a temporary community. Responsibility for safety and organization was often shared among experienced travelers. Decisions regarding travel speed, river crossings, or campsite locations required careful judgment. Some wagon trains created simple agreements to guide behavior during the journey. These informal codes helped prevent disputes and ensured that everyone contributed to the common effort. Such cooperation proved especially valuable as the landscape grew more demanding. Gradually, the distant outline of the Rocky Mountains began to appear along the western horizon. At first, the peaks resembled faint shadows rising against the sky. Their blue silhouettes seemed almost unreal after so many weeks spent crossing open plains. But with each passing day, the mountains grew slightly larger. The sight stirred powerful emotions among many travelers. For some, the mountains symbolized the final barrier between the plains and the fertile valleys of the Pacific Northwest. For others, they represented the most uncertain stage of the entire journey. Crossing such immense terrain with heavy wagons would require patience, strength, and careful navigation. Before reaching the mountains themselves, the trail passed through several important landmarks that served as waypoints for travelers. One of these was Scott's Bluff, a towering formation of stone rising dramatically above the surrounding plains. Its steep cliffs and broad summit formed one of the most recognizable features along the Oregon Trail. For wagon trains approaching from the east, the bluff appeared as a massive gateway marking the western edge of the prairie. Passing through this region often filled travelers with a renewed sense of progress. Another notable location nearby was the area that would later become known as Fort Laramie. Originally established as a trading post during the early 19th century, the fort gradually expanded into a significant center of activity along the trail. Its wooden walls and clustered buildings stood near the meeting point of the North Platte and Laramie rivers. For many migrants, arriving near this settlement offered a rare moment of relative stability. Here, travelers could rest their animals, repair damaged wagons, and replenish limited supplies before continuing deeper into the Western Territories. The presence of the fort also reflected the growing importance of the Oregon Trail as a route of migration and commerce. Military patrols occasionally operated from this location, providing a measure of order within the expanding frontier. After leaving the vicinity of Fort Laramie, the wagon trains resumed their steady movement toward the mountains. The trail now began following smaller streams that cut through gradually rising terrain. The once flat prairie slowly gave way to rolling hills and rocky ridges. Grass still covered much of the landscape, yet scattered shrubs and clusters of pine trees began appearing in certain areas. Wildlife changed as well. Deer moved quietly through the brush near the hillsides, while smaller animals such as foxes and rabbits darted among the rocks. Bird calls echoed differently here, carried across valleys rather than open plains. The journey had entered a region where the geography of the continent was shifting. Travelers sensed this transition not only through the changing scenery, but also through the physical effort required to move forward. Wagons creaked more loudly while climbing gradual inclines. Oxen leaned heavily into their harnesses as they pulled the loads upward. Beyond the last broad stretches of prairie, the trail gradually approached a region where the land began folding into ridges and valleys shaped by ancient forces. The open horizon that had once stretched endlessly now appeared interrupted by distant slopes and clusters of dark vegetation. The air itself seemed different here, carrying faint scents of pine and dry earth drifting from the rising terrain ahead. The presence of the mountains grew more real with every passing day. What had once been a pale outline along the edge of the sky slowly transformed into detailed shapes of cliffs, ridgelines, and shadowed valleys. The Rocky Mountains stood like a vast wall across the western edge of the continent, their peaks often capped with lingering snow even during the warmer months. Travel along the trail now required greater attention. The path that once followed broad river valleys began winding through narrower corridors where rocky ground replaced the soft soil of the plains. Wagon wheels rolled across gravel and uneven surfaces, producing a sharper sound than the dull rumble heard earlier on the prairie. Oxen continued their steady labor, though the effort demanded from them increased as the trail climbed gradually upward. Streams flowing from the mountains crossed the route frequently. These waters ran colder and faster than the rivers of the plains, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. Their banks often contained stones polished smooth by constant movement of water. Crossing such streams required careful judgment. Travelers examined the current, searched for shallow sections, and sometimes reinforced wagon beds with extra coverings to protect supplies from splashing water. Even small crossings could become complicated when dozens of wagons attempted them in succession. Despite these challenges, the presence of fresh water offered important advantages. Clear streams provided reliable sources for drinking, cooking, and washing clothes that had accumulated weeks of dust along the trail. The surrounding environment also introduced a different variety of plant life. Where grasses once dominated the landscape almost entirely, small groves of trees now appeared more frequently. Cottonwoods lined many of the stream banks, while juniper and pine began covering the hillsides. These trees offered rare shade during midday hours and supplied valuable firewood for evening camps. The wildlife of the region reflected this change in habitat. Birdsong echoed from wooded slopes, and travelers occasionally glimpsed animals moving silently through the trees. Elk sometimes appeared near distant ridges, their large forms visible for only brief moments before disappearing among the shadows of the forest. The soundscape of the trail changed as well. Instead of the constant whisper of wind across open grasslands, the travelers now heard water flowing over stones, branches shifting gently overhead, and the creaking echoes of wagons moving through narrow valleys. These sounds created an atmosphere that felt both unfamiliar and quietly impressive. The approach toward the mountains brought new concerns regarding timing. Experienced travelers understood that reaching certain mountain passes before the arrival of autumn snow could determine the success of the entire journey. Snowfall at high elevations might close the trail completely, trapping wagon trains within harsh conditions long before they reached the valleys of Oregon. Because of this, the pace of travel remained steady whenever possible. Long pauses became less frequent. Even during difficult stretches of terrain, the wagons continued advancing day after day toward the high country that now dominated the western horizon. Gradually, the trail approached one of the most important landmarks along the entire route, South Pass. Unlike many dramatic mountain passes found elsewhere in the Rockies, South Pass appeared surprisingly gentle. Instead of steep cliffs or narrow canyon walls, the pass formed a broad saddle between mountain ranges. Its gradual slopes allowed wagons to cross the continental divide without facing the extreme barriers that might have blocked the migration entirely. This natural corridor had long been known to indigenous travelers and fur trappers before becoming a central route for wagon trains heading west. Approaching the pass, the land rose slowly across wide basins where sagebrush covered the dry ground. The vegetation here differed sharply from the lush grasses of the plains. Sagebrush spread in silver-green clusters across the landscape, releasing a distinct fragrance when brushed by passing animals or wagon wheels. The soil appeared pale and dusty, reflecting the drier climate that dominated the high interior regions of the continent. Wind moved almost constantly across these open basins. Without the protection of tall grasses or forests, the air swept freely across the land, sometimes carrying fine dust that settled over the wagons and travelers alike. Despite the dryness of the terrain, several streams still flowed through the region, fed by melting snow from nearby mountains. These waterways provided essential stopping points where wagon trains could rest and gather water before continuing the climb. As the travelers approached the highest point of the trail, the elevation itself became noticeable. The air felt thinner and cooler, particularly during early morning hours. Nights often brought a sharp chill even when the days remained warm beneath the bright mountain sun. Campfires burned more frequently during these evenings, not only for cooking but also for warmth. Reaching South Pass carried symbolic meaning for many migrants. At this quiet point along the trail, the waters flowing east toward the Mississippi River and those moving west toward the Pacific Ocean separated from one another. Crossing this divide meant that the journey had passed the midpoint of the continent. The wagons now stood on the western side of the Rocky Mountains. For some travelers, this moment inspired quiet reflection. The immense distance already covered stretched far behind them across plains, rivers, and hills. Yet an equally demanding stretch of land still waited ahead. Beyond the divide lay the vast interior basins and deserts of the Western Territories. After crossing South Pass, the trail descended gradually into new landscapes that appeared both stark and striking. Broad valleys opened between distant mountain ranges. The ground often appeared dry and rocky, with scattered vegetation adapted to limited rainfall. Sagebrush remained common, along with low shrubs that clung to the soil in small clusters. The sky seemed even larger here than it had across the plains. Without tall forests or dense vegetation, the horizon stretched across enormous distances. Sunlight illuminated the land with intense brightness during the day, while evenings brought sudden drops in temperature once the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Water sources became more scattered within this region. Streams and springs existed, but they required careful planning to reach. Wagon trains relied on knowledge passed along by earlier travelers regarding the location of these precious resources. Missing a water stop could create serious difficulties for both people and animals. Because of this, the migration often followed established camping locations that had become familiar along the trail. Certain sites offered reliable water, grazing areas for livestock, and ground suitable for resting wagons after long days of travel. These locations gradually formed a chain of resting points stretching across the Western Territories. Another important landmark awaited the travelers farther along the route, Independence Rock. This enormous granite formation rose suddenly from the surrounding plain like a massive dome of pale stone. Its smooth surface reflected sunlight across the valley, making it visible from great distances. For many wagon trains, reaching Independence Rock served as a calendar marker during the journey. Migrants often hoped to arrive at this location by early July. Doing so indicated that the travel pace remained favorable for crossing the remaining mountains before winter. Over the years, countless travelers carved their names into the rock's surface using tools or simple knives. These inscriptions formed a growing record of migration, with dates and names etched across the granite as silent testimony to those who had passed before. Standing near the base of the rock, one could see layers of these markings covering large sections of the stone. Each name represented a family, a wagon, a long journey undertaken across the continent. Leaving such a mark carried personal significance for many travelers. It served as a small declaration that their presence had become part of the long story unfolding along the Oregon Trail. After passing Independence Rock, the trail continued weaving through valleys and along the banks of winding rivers that flowed westward. The mountains surrounding these valleys appeared rugged and remote. Their slopes displayed patches of forest mixed with exposed stone where erosion had carved dramatic shapes across the terrain. Travel through these regions demanded patience. Wagons moved carefully along narrow sections of trail where steep hillsides dropped toward rivers below. Oxen worked steadily to pull the heavy loads across ground that sometimes tilted sharply beneath the wheels. Despite the increasing difficulty, the travelers pressed onward. Morning light slowly spread across the valleys west of the Continental Divide, revealing a landscape that appeared both stark and vast. The ground stretched outward in muted tones of gray and pale green, interrupted by clusters of sagebrush that clung stubbornly to the dry soil. Distant mountain ridges stood like quiet sentinels along the horizon, their slopes fading into the blue haze of distance. The wagon trains moved carefully through this new region, where the terrain carried a harsher character than the plains left behind. Here, the trail passed through what many travelers later remembered as the long interior basins of the Western Territories. These valleys often received little rainfall, leaving the soil cracked and dusty beneath the steady sun. The air held a dryness that quickly drained moisture from both travelers and animals. Even breathing sometimes felt different in this climate. The air remained clear and open, yet its dryness lingered on the lips and throat. Water became more valuable with every mile traveled. The wagon trains adjusted their routines once again. While earlier portions of the trail offered rivers that followed the migration for weeks at a time, this region forced travelers to plan carefully between scattered streams and isolated springs. Knowledge of these locations passed from one wagon train to another, often preserved in handwritten trail guides carried by experienced migrants. Some travelers also relied on information left behind in small signs or markers along the route. At certain campsites, scraps of wood had been carved with brief notes pointing toward the next reliable water source. In other places, shallow pits in the ground marked where earlier groups had dug to uncover hidden moisture beneath the dry surface. These quiet traces formed a kind of shared memory across the trail. Despite the dryness, life still existed throughout the region in subtle forms. Low grasses pushed through the soil wherever small amounts of moisture collected. Tiny wildflowers appeared briefly after rare rainfall, spreading patches of color across otherwise pale ground. Small animals adapted well to this environment. Prairie dogs occasionally emerged from burrows near the trail, watching the passing wagons with cautious curiosity before disappearing beneath the earth again. Birds circled above the valleys, carried by rising currents of warm air that lifted them effortlessly across the open sky. The wagon trains continued forward in long, slow lines that stretched across the dusty landscape. Each wagon creaked gently as its wooden frame absorbed the constant movement of the trail. Iron-rimmed wheels rolled steadily over gravel and packed soil, leaving faint tracks that would soon fade beneath wind and time. Oxen remained the primary source of strength pulling the wagons. Their patient nature proved essential in such demanding conditions. Unlike horses, which could tire quickly under heavy loads, oxen maintained a steady pace across long distances. They moved with quiet determination, leaning forward against the weight of the wagons as they advanced through the basin country. Caring for these animals became one of the most important responsibilities within the wagon trains. Each evening, the oxen were guided toward whatever grazing areas could be found near the campsite. Although vegetation remained sparse in many places, patches of grass still appeared along stream beds or in sheltered valleys where moisture gathered. Travelers carefully watched the animals for signs of exhaustion or injury. A single lost ox could slow an entire wagon train, since replacing such an animal far from settlements proved extremely difficult. As the journey progressed deeper into the Western Territories, the trail approached another significant river, the Green River. Unlike the scattered streams of the surrounding basins, the Green River flowed with greater strength and depth. Its waters wound through rocky banks lined with shrubs and occasional cottonwood trees. Reaching this river offered a welcome opportunity to rest beside dependable water. Yet crossing it presented a serious challenge. The river's current moved steadily through channels that sometimes ran deeper than expected. Wagon trains often paused here for extended periods while preparing safe crossings. In certain locations, ferries operated by traders provided assistance. These flat wooden platforms floated upon the river, guided across the water by ropes or poles. Wagons were carefully rolled onto the ferry one at a time before being transported to the opposite bank. Such services often required payment, yet many travelers considered the cost worthwhile when compared with the risk of attempting a direct crossing. Those who chose to ford the river instead approached slowly, guiding their animals through shallow sections where the current remained manageable. Even then, the process required patience and careful coordination. Water sometimes reached the wagon beds, soaking wheels and splashing against stored supplies. Despite these difficulties, most crossings eventually succeeded through steady effort. After leaving the Green River behind, the trail continued toward regions where volcanic forces long ago shaped the land. Dark fields of ancient lava rock began appearing across certain portions of the route. These formations created rough surfaces where wagon wheels clattered loudly against the hardened stone. The ground here carried a different appearance from the earlier valleys. Sharp black rocks covered wide areas, creating landscapes that looked almost barren at first glance. Yet even within these fields, hardy plants found ways to survive. Small grasses pushed through narrow cracks in the stone, while low shrubs spread cautiously between scattered rocks. Travel through these areas demanded extra care. Wagon wheels could break if forced too quickly across the jagged terrain. The oxen stepped slowly, testing the ground beneath each hoof. Despite the difficulty, these volcanic plains revealed striking views. The dark rocks contrasted sharply with the bright sky above and the distant mountains that framed the horizon. During evening hours, the setting sun painted the stone surfaces with warm shades of orange and red. Beyond these lava fields, the trail approached one of the most demanding natural obstacles along the western route, the Snake River Plain. This immense stretch of land extended across present-day Idaho, shaped by ancient volcanic activity and powerful rivers. The terrain appeared broad and open, yet it contained challenges that tested the endurance of every wagon train. The Snake River itself carved deep channels through parts of the plain. In some places, the river flowed far below steep canyon walls, making direct access to water extremely difficult. Travelers sometimes passed within sight of the river for miles without finding a safe route down to its banks. As a result, certain sections of the trail became known for their dryness and isolation. Dust rose behind the wagons in pale clouds that drifted slowly across the plain. The sun shone intensely during midday hours, reflecting from the light-colored soil. Even small breezes carried heat across the open ground. To cope with these conditions, many wagon trains adjusted their travel schedules. Early morning departures allowed several hours of movement before the strongest heat arrived. Midday often brought longer rest periods beneath the limited shade provided by wagons or scattered shrubs. Late afternoon travel then continued until the sun began dropping toward the western horizon. These adjustments helped preserve the strength of both people and animals. Along certain portions of the Snake River Plain, earlier travelers had created alternate paths that attempted to avoid the most difficult terrain. One such route later became known as the Hudspeth Cutoff. This shortcut promised a faster journey toward the Columbia River, yet it also carried significant risks due to scarce water sources. Some wagon trains chose to follow it in hopes of saving valuable time. Others remained on the traditional route despite the longer distance. Decisions like these reflected the constant balance between caution and urgency that defined life along the Oregon Trail. Every mile traveled carried consequences for the weeks that followed. Meanwhile, the surrounding environment continued revealing new sights unfamiliar to many migrants. Clusters of tall basalt cliffs rose in certain areas, their layered rock formations revealing ancient eruptions that shaped the region long before human travel reached these valleys. Birds nested within narrow ledges carved into the stone, while hawks circled high above the open plains searching for movement below. At night, the sky above the Snake River Plain appeared immense beyond imagination. Without the smoke of large settlements or the glow of artificial lights, the stars filled the darkness in brilliant patterns stretching from horizon to horizon. The Milky Way spread across the sky like a faint river of light. For many travelers, these quiet evenings offered rare moments of reflection. After months on the trail, the rhythm of the journey had become deeply familiar. Wagons creaked, fires crackled softly, and animals rested nearby after the long day's movement. Each individual carried private thoughts about the distance already traveled and the unknown land still waiting ahead. The Pacific Northwest lay somewhere beyond the final mountain ranges, still hidden along the western edge of the plain. And so, beneath the endless sky of the interior West, The wagon trains prepared themselves to continue the long migration toward rivers and valleys that few among them had ever seen, but which had already begun shaping their hopes for the future. The wide expanse of the Snake River plain slowly faded behind the wagon trains as the trail bent northwestward toward higher country. In the distance, darker ridges began rising above the horizon once again, forming the outer edges of mountain ranges that marked the next stage of the journey. These heights appeared less massive than the Rocky Mountains already crossed, yet they carried their own challenges for travelers who had already endured months of steady movement. The air gradually shifted as the wagons approached these new elevations. Cooler breezes drifted across the land during morning hours, carrying faint scents of damp soil and distant forests. The dryness of the interior basins gave way to valleys where streams flowed more frequently and vegetation grew thicker along the slopes. Grass returned in broader patches, offering better grazing for the livestock that had labored so long across the desert-like plains. The presence of these greener landscapes brought quiet relief to many migrants. Oxen and horses fed more easily, lowering the daily anxiety that had followed each search for forage across the earlier stretches of dry terrain. Evening camps sometimes rested beside shallow creeks shaded by cottonwoods and willow trees whose branches swayed gently in the cooling air. Water ran steadily across smooth stones, its sound blending with the soft movements of animals settling for the night. Despite these improvements in the environment, the trail itself became more complicated. The route climbed gradually through a region where volcanic hills and scattered mountains created winding valleys between ridges of dark stone. Wagon trains followed narrow paths worn by earlier travelers and fur traders who had passed through this region decades before. One of the most important rivers guiding the migration now appeared ahead. The Snake River curved through the land like a long blue ribbon, cutting deep canyons through layers of ancient rock. In many places, its waters rushed far below steep cliffs, making direct travel along its banks impossible. The trail therefore remained some distance from the river for extended stretches. Occasionally, the path descended towards smaller tributaries where water could be reached more easily. These smaller streams served as essential resting places where travelers refilled barrels, washed clothing, and allowed livestock to drink deeply after long hours of walking. The surrounding terrain revealed dramatic geological features shaped by ancient volcanic eruptions. Wide fields of basalt rocks stretched across portions of the landscape, forming uneven ground that echoed loudly beneath the wagon wheels. In other areas, tall pillars of stone stood like silent towers carved by wind and time. Some migrants later described these formations as resembling ruined castles scattered across the wilderness. The soil within certain valleys proved surprisingly fertile despite the rugged surroundings. Wild grasses and flowering plants covered the slopes during the warmer months. Lavender-colored lupin and small yellow blossoms appeared beside the trail, brightening the otherwise muted tones of the land. Bees moved quietly among these flowers, while butterflies drifted across the open meadows. Wildlife grew more varied as the wagon trains advanced toward regions that received greater rainfall. Deer emerged cautiously from forest edges at dawn, grazing in open clearings before retreating into thicker cover as the sun rose higher. Coyotes sometimes called across the valleys during evening hours, their distant cries echoing through the hills. Travelers occasionally spotted black bears moving along remote slopes where berry bushes provided food during late summer. These sightings reminded migrants that the land they crossed remained largely untouched by permanent settlements. Yet signs of earlier human presence appeared as well. Long before wagon trains began traveling this route, indigenous nations had moved across these valleys following seasonal patterns of hunting, fishing, and gathering. Narrow footpaths sometimes intersected the wagon trail, worn into the soil through generations of movement. Fishing camps occasionally appeared near rivers where salmon migrated upstream each year. Smoke rising faintly from distant valleys sometimes revealed the presence of indigenous communities living within the surrounding mountains. Encounters between migrants and these communities varied greatly, depending on location and circumstance. In certain places, small exchanges of goods occurred quietly along the trail. Travelers sometimes traded cloth, metal tools, or food items in return for fish, berries, or guidance regarding the safest route ahead. Knowledge of local geography held immense value in such remote landscapes. As summer slowly progressed, the wagon trains approached one of the most significant turning points along the western portion of the Oregon Trail, the crossing of the Snake River near present-day southern Idaho. This section of the journey required careful planning. The river here flowed wide and swift, its current strengthened by water descending from the mountains far to the east. Wagon trains often paused for several days while preparing for the difficult crossing. In some locations, ferries again operated to assist migrants in reaching the opposite bank. These services had developed gradually as the trail became busier each year. Flatboats constructed from sturdy timber floated upon the water, guided carefully across the current by ropes stretched between the banks. Wagons rolled slowly onto the ferry platforms while oxen waited patiently nearby. Once secured, the ferry drifted across the river, carrying its heavy cargo toward the western shore where the next stage of the trail awaited. Not every wagon train used these ferries. Some groups searched for shallow fording points where the current appeared manageable. These crossings demanded coordination and patience. Animals were guided slowly into the water while travelers steadied the wagons against the pressure of the flowing river. The cold water often rose high against the wagon wheels, splashing across wooden sides and soaking garments worn by those guiding the animals. Yet with steady effort, most crossings succeeded. Once the river stood behind them, the migrants entered territory where the character of the land began shifting again. Rolling hills gradually transformed into forested mountains. Pine and fir trees spread across the slopes in thick clusters, their dark green needles forming deep shade beneath the branches. The scent of resin filled the air, carried by cool breezes drifting through the valleys. These forests offered a dramatic contrast to the open plains and deserts that had dominated earlier months of travel. Tall trunks rose high above the ground, and the canopy overhead filtered sunlight into soft patterns across the forest floor. Moss covered fallen logs while ferns grew in shaded hollows where moisture gathered. The trail wound upward through these woods, sometimes climbing steep ridges before descending into narrow valleys carved by mountain streams. The sound of wagon wheels changed once again. Instead of grinding against dry gravel or volcanic rock, the wheels rolled across soil, softened by fallen needles and damp earth. The creaking of wooden frames echoed faintly among the trees. Travelers now found themselves surrounded by landscapes that felt older and quieter than the plains. The mountains formed natural corridors through which the trail slowly advanced. Some sections required wagons to travel in single file along narrow ledges overlooking rushing streams below. In other places the path passed through broad meadows hidden within the forests, where wildflowers and tall grasses swayed gently in the wind. These sheltered meadows often became favored campsites. Fresh water flowed nearby, and abundant grass allowed livestock to feed well after the demanding stages of the journey. Evenings here felt peaceful compared with the exposed camps along the desert plains. Campfires flickered beneath towering trees while the sounds of the forest gradually replaced the distant winds of the open prairie. Yet even within these tranquil settings, the migrants remained aware that their journey was not yet complete. Farther west lay one of the most formidable barriers remaining on the Oregon Trail, the Blue Mountains. These rugged highlands stretched across northeastern Oregon, forming steep ridges covered with dense forests and rocky slopes. Crossing them required careful navigation through winding passes and narrow valleys. The approach toward these mountains unfolded slowly as the wagon trains moved through the forested country of present-day Idaho. Days of travel carried them closer to the rising ridges that darkened the western horizon. Rainfall became more frequent in these regions. Clouds gathered around the mountain peaks during afternoon hours, sometimes releasing brief showers that dampened the trail. The smell of wet earth filled the forest after such storms, and mist drifted among the trees during cool mornings. For travelers who had endured months of dry air and dust, these conditions felt refreshing. Streams flowed more strongly, and vegetation appeared lush and vibrant across the valleys. As the wagons continued westward beneath towering pines and shifting mountain clouds, the trail gradually prepared them for the final great crossing that stood between the migrants and the fertile valleys of the Pacific Northwest. The forested hills gradually thickened as the wagon trains advanced toward the rising ridges of the Blue Mountains. Tall stands of pine, fir, and cedar covered the slopes in deep layers of green, their branches forming a wide canopy that softened the bright sunlight of late summer. Shadows stretched across the narrow trail, while cool air drifted quietly through the trees. The land felt entirely different from the open plains that had marked the beginning of the journey months earlier. Instead of vast horizons, travelers now moved through enclosed valleys where mountains surrounded them on nearly every side. The trail climbed steadily upward, weaving between hillsides and streams that flowed swiftly through the forests. These waters carried a clear, cold freshness that revealed their origins in the higher elevations. Rivulets tumbled over stones, creating constant sounds that echoed gently through the wooded slopes. Moss grew thick along the edges of these streams, and fallen logs lay across the forest floor where time had slowly returned them to the earth. Travel through this region required patience and caution. The wagons moved slowly along winding paths where tree roots sometimes crossed the trail and steep inclines forced the oxen to strain against their harnesses. In some places, travelers needed to reinforce sections of the trail by placing branches or stones beneath the wheels to prevent wagons from slipping on damp soil. Despite these difficulties, the forests offered several advantages that the plains had rarely provided. Fresh water appeared frequently in the form of springs and creeks. Grass and wild plants flourished in the open meadows scattered between the wooded ridges, providing better grazing for animals that had grown thin during the harsher stages of the journey. Wildlife became more abundant as well. Deer moved quietly among the trees at dawn and dusk, their movements almost silent across the forest floor. Elk occasionally appeared in the distance, their large forms visible through breaks in the trees as they grazed in sheltered valleys. Birds filled the canopy with a variety of calls unfamiliar to many travelers who had spent most of their lives in eastern landscapes. Some wagon trains paused to hunt when opportunities arose, adding fresh meat to their limited food supplies. Game provided welcome nourishment after months of relying largely on preserved provisions carried from the beginning of the journey. Yet hunting also required time and caution, since the main objective remained reaching Oregon before the arrival of colder weather. The Blue Mountains represented one of the final great barriers along the Oregon Trail. Their ridges rose in overlapping layers that stretched across northeastern Oregon like a vast wall of forested peaks. Snow could appear early within these high elevations, especially during late autumn. For this reason, wagon trains pushed forward with renewed determination. The trail climbed gradually through passes that wound between steep slopes. Pine needles covered the ground in thick carpets that muffled the sounds of movement. Occasionally, the forest opened to reveal wide meadows surrounded by mountain ridges glowing beneath the afternoon sun. These open spaces offered breathtaking views that many migrants later remembered vividly. From certain ridgelines, the valleys below appeared as rolling seas of green forest stretching toward distant mountains fading into blue haze. Clouds drifted slowly across the sky, casting moving shadows across the slopes. Even during these moments of beauty, the physical effort required to guide heavy wagons through the mountains remained considerable. At steep inclines, additional oxen were sometimes attached to a single wagon to help pull it upward. Men walked beside the wheels to prevent them from rolling backward during difficult climbs. Women and children often carried smaller bundles by hand to lighten the load temporarily. Once the wagons reached the crest of a ridge, the process reversed. Careful braking became necessary to guide the heavy vehicles safely down the other side. Wooden brake blocks were pressed against the wheels to slow their descent along narrow paths that curved sharply between trees. Progress through the mountains unfolded slowly, yet each mile carried the migrants closer to the lands they had imagined throughout the long journey. Beyond these highlands lay the river valleys leading toward the Columbia River. One such river soon appeared along the route, the Grande Ronde. This winding waterway flowed through a wide valley surrounded by mountain slopes covered in forest and grassland. The valley offered fertile ground where grasses grew thick and green beneath the open sky. Many wagon trains paused here to rest after the demanding mountain crossing. Animals grazed eagerly across the meadows, regaining strength before the next stage of travel. The calm surroundings allowed travelers to repair worn equipment and wash clothing that had endured months of dust and sweat. The Grande Ronde Valley also held long-standing importance for indigenous communities who had lived in this region for generations. Seasonal camps sometimes appeared near the riverbanks where fishing and gathering provided essential resources. Salmon runs along nearby rivers formed a central part of life within these landscapes. The presence of these communities reflected a long history connected deeply with the land. From the Grande Ronde Valley, the trail continued westward toward the final river systems, guiding travelers into Oregon's interior. The path gradually descended from the higher mountains into rolling foothills where forests began thinning into mixed grasslands and groves of oak trees. The climate here felt milder than the colder elevations already crossed. Warm sunlight returned to the valleys during daytime hours, while cool evenings carried the scent of damp soil and distant rivers. Soon another major waterway came into view, the Umatilla River. This river wound through gentle valleys that gradually opened toward the vast Columbia Plateau. Its banks supported thick grasses and scattered trees that swayed softly in the breeze. Following the river allowed wagon trains to travel more easily after the difficult mountain passages. The trail now moved across ground shaped by ancient floods and volcanic forces that had once carved enormous channels through the region. Wide basalt cliffs sometimes appeared along the horizon, their dark stone faces rising sharply above the valleys below. Beyond these cliffs lay the Columbia River itself. For many migrants, reaching this river marked a moment of profound significance. The Columbia flowed westward toward the Pacific Ocean, forming one of the largest waterways in North America. Its wide currents carved a path through the land that had served as a natural travel route for indigenous nations and explorers long before wagon trains arrived. The final stage of the Oregon Trail often followed this mighty river toward the fertile Willamette Valley. Yet the Columbia presented its own challenges. Steep cliffs lined portions of its banks, forcing travelers to choose between several difficult routes. Some wagon trains attempted to guide their wagons along narrow paths carved into the rocky slopes above the water. Others constructed rafts to float portions of their journey downstream. These raft journeys required courage and careful preparation. Wagons were dismantled partially, their components tied securely together with ropes before being placed upon flat wooden rafts. Livestock sometimes swam beside these floating platforms while travelers guided the craft along the powerful current. The river's wide expanse carried them past towering cliffs and dense forests that lined its banks. Wind swept across the water while distant mountains rose along the horizon. For many migrants, this final river passage formed one of the most memorable experiences of the entire journey. After months of walking beside wagons across plains, deserts, and mountains, they now moved quietly across flowing water toward the western edge of the continent. Gradually, the landscape began transforming once again. Rainfall increased noticeably in these western regions. Forests grew thicker and more varied, filled with towering Douglas fir and cedar trees that reached enormous heights above the forest floor. Ferns spread across damp soil while moss draped itself across branches and fallen logs. The climate felt softer and more humid than the dry lands crossed earlier. Clouds often drifted across the sky, bringing gentle rain that nourished the dense vegetation of the Pacific Northwest. These forests created an atmosphere unlike anything many migrants had experienced before. Light filtered softly through layers of leaves and needles, while streams wound through deep green valleys filled with birdsong and the distant sound of rushing water. Somewhere beyond these forests lay the Willamette Valley, the destination that had drawn so many travelers across the continent. The valley promised fertile soil, mild climate, and the possibility of building entirely new lives upon land that appeared rich with opportunity. And so, as the wagon trains continued following the great river toward the west, the final chapter of their long migration slowly unfolded beneath the towering forests of Oregon. The immense forests of the Pacific Northwest gradually surrounded the final stages of the journey. Towering trees rose far above the trail, their thick trunks forming silent columns that stretched toward a sky often veiled by drifting clouds. Sunlight filtered through layers of branches, reaching the forest floor in soft beams that illuminated ferns, moss, and damp soil beneath the traveler's feet. The land here felt rich and deeply alive. Moist air carried the scent of pine needles, wet bark, an earth that had absorbed countless seasons of rain. Streams flowed steadily across the landscape, winding through valleys shaded by dense vegetation. After months spent crossing dry plains and dusty basins, the presence of so much water and greenery created a sense of quiet wonder among many migrants. The trail continued westward along routes shaped by explorers, traders, and indigenous communities long before wagon trains arrived. Portions of the path followed gentle ridges where the ground remained firm beneath the wagons. Other sections descended into low valleys where wooden bridges or simple log crossings had been constructed to pass over marshy ground. The steady rainfall common to this region influenced every aspect of travel. Soft soil often turned muddy beneath the weight of wagon wheels, forcing the travelers to move carefully to prevent wagons from sinking into the ground. Oxen strained against their harnesses while guiding the heavy loads through narrow corridors of forest. Despite these challenges, the environment offered advantages that had been rare along the earlier portions of the trail. Vegetation grew in abundance, providing forage for animals and materials for building shelters or repairing wagons. Fallen branches supplied firewood without the long searches that had once been necessary across the open plains. Small berries grew along forest edges, their bright colors visible among green leaves. Blackberries, salmonberries, and huckleberries ripened during late summer, adding fresh flavor to the migrants' diet after many weeks of preserved foods. Birdlife filled the forest with constant movement and sound. Woodpeckers tapped rhythmically against tree trunks, while smaller birds flitted through the undergrowth searching for insects among fallen leaves. Occasionally, travelers glimpsed larger birds circling high above the forest canopy, where currents of cool air lifted them easily. The journey now passed through lands that had supported indigenous cultures for thousands of years. Along certain rivers and valleys, fishing sites had long served as gathering places where communities harvested salmon during their seasonal migrations. Smoke sometimes drifted above distant clearings where these camps existed quietly within the forests. Carved wooden tools, fishing weirs, and other traces of traditional life occasionally appeared near riverbanks, reflecting a deep relationship between people and the rivers that sustained them. For many migrants, these final stages of travel felt both hopeful and uncertain. The long road behind them had reshaped daily habits, expectations, and relationships within each wagon train. Months of shared effort had created strong bonds among families who had begun the journey as strangers. Now, as the forests of Oregon grew thicker and the air carried the constant promise of rain, the destination itself finally seemed close. Gradually, the trail descended toward the wide valleys that stretched between the coastal mountain ranges. Among these fertile lands, one region had become the primary goal for thousands of migrants, the Willamette Valley. This vast valley extended north and south between forested hills, watered by rivers that flowed steadily toward the Columbia. The soil here appeared dark and rich, formed by centuries of natural flooding and seasonal rainfall. Grasslands spread across the valley floor, broken occasionally by oak groves and scattered patches of forest. When wagon trains first entered this region, the change in landscape felt remarkable. After crossing deserts, mountains, and endless plains, the valley opened before them as a broad and welcoming space where farmland could easily be imagined. Rivers meandered across the land in gentle curves, their banks lined with tall grasses that swayed in the breeze. Wildflowers grew across open meadows, creating patches of color that brightened the late summer landscape. The climate also felt noticeably milder. Warm days alternated with cool evenings, while clouds often gathered overhead before releasing gentle rain that refreshed the soil. For migrants who had endured dust storms, blazing heat, and freezing mountain nights, these conditions seemed almost peaceful. Arriving in the valley did not immediately end the challenges of the journey. Many travelers still needed to locate suitable land claims where they could begin building permanent homes. Early settlers often relied on information shared by missionaries, traders, and earlier migrants who had already established small communities within the region. Some settlements had begun forming around mission stations that provided limited assistance to newcomers. Wooden buildings stood beside cultivated fields where wheat, vegetables, and fruit trees had already begun growing. These early farms offered visible proof that the valley could support long-term settlement. For many migrants, this realization carried powerful meaning. The months of hardship along the trail had always been guided by the belief that a better life waited somewhere beyond the western mountains. Now the land itself seemed to confirm that belief. Families began constructing simple cabins using timber gathered from nearby forests. Trees were cut, trimmed, and fitted together to form walls strong enough to withstand the damp winters of the Pacific Northwest. Roofs were covered with wooden shingles split from cedar logs. Fields required clearing before crops could be planted. Large stumps had to be removed from the soil, often through slow and difficult labor involving axes, ropes, and teams of oxen. Brush and smaller trees were burned to create open ground for farming. These early efforts marked the beginning of a new stage of life. The wagon trains that had carried migrants across the continent gradually disappeared as permanent homes replaced temporary camps. Oxen that had pulled wagons for thousands of miles now worked fields or grazed in nearby pastures. Tools once used for travel repairs became instruments for building barns, fences, and storage sheds. Communities slowly formed as more migrants arrived each year along the same long trail. Paths that once carried wagons through wilderness eventually developed into roads connecting farms and settlements across the valley. Small trading posts expanded into towns where supplies could be exchanged and news shared among settlers. Schools and churches began appearing within these growing communities, reflecting the desire to establish stable lives after the uncertainty of migration. Yet the memory of the journey itself remained deeply present in the minds of those who had traveled the Oregon Trail. Stories of the plains, rivers, deserts, and mountains became part of family history passed from one generation to the next. The creaking of wagon wheels, the endless horizon of grasslands, the narrow passes through towering mountains. All of these experiences shaped the identity of those who had made the journey. Even years later, many settlers could still recall the feeling of walking beside the wagons at dawn while the prairie wind moved through tall grass. They remembered the long lines of travelers stretching across dusty trails and the quiet camps beneath stars that filled the night sky. These memories remain tied forever to the landscape of the American West. The Oregon Trail itself gradually changed as railroads and new forms of transportation replaced wagon travel during the later 19th century. Steel tracks eventually crossed many of the same regions once traveled by ox-drawn wagons. Journeys that once required months could later be completed in far shorter time. Yet the trail's legacy endured. Across the plains, mountains, and valleys of the western United States, faint traces of the old wagon routes still remain etched into the earth. Shallow ruts carved by thousands of wagon wheels continue to mark certain stretches of ground where migrants once passed in long caravans moving toward uncertain futures. These marks serve as quiet reminders of the immense effort required to cross a continent before modern transportation existed. For those who lived through the journey, the Oregon Trail represented far more than a path across the land. It was a passage through changing landscapes, harsh climates, and unfamiliar environments that tested endurance, patience, and cooperation. Every mile required effort from both people and animals working together under conditions that often pushed them to the limits of their strength. Yet despite these hardships, the trail carried thousands toward new opportunities in lands that seemed full of promise. The forests, rivers, and fertile valleys of Oregon eventually became home to many who had once walked beside wagons across distant plains. And long after the final wagon train completed the journey, the quiet story of that migration continued living within the landscapes that had witnessed it. Autumn gradually settled across the Willamette Valley during the first months after the wagon trains arrived. Mornings often began beneath a layer of soft gray mist that drifted slowly above the fields and rivers. Dew gathered across tall grasses, sparkling faintly when the rising sun finally pushed through the clouds. For the new settlers, this season marked the true beginning of life beyond the trail. The journey had ended, yet the work required to establish a permanent home was only beginning. Families who had traveled thousands of miles now turned their attention toward shaping the unfamiliar land into places where crops could grow and shelter could endure through the coming winters. Cabins built quickly upon arrival needed improvement before the cold months deepened. Gaps between logs were filled with clay and moss to block damp winds that swept across the valley during seasonal storms. Roofs were strengthened with additional shingles cut from cedar trees. Fireplaces constructed from stone became essential features within each home, providing warmth during the long rainy evenings of the Pacific Northwest. The climate of this region differed greatly from the lands many settlers had left behind. Rain fell regularly throughout autumn and winter, soaking the soil and filling the rivers that wound across the valley. Streams overflowed their banks during periods of heavy rainfall, creating temporary wetlands that attracted flocks of waterfowl. Geese and ducks gathered in large numbers along shallow lakes and marshes scattered across the lowlands. The constant moisture nourished dense vegetation. Ferns spread across shaded areas while moss crept steadily over tree trunks and fallen branches. Fields cleared during the late summer quickly filled with new growth, revealing the fertility of the soil beneath the surface. Planting crops became one of the most important tasks during the first full year of settlement. Wheat proved particularly well suited to the valley's conditions. Farmers prepared the ground by turning the soil with plows pulled by oxen that had once hauled wagons across the continent. Seeds were scattered across newly opened fields where rain and mild temperatures encouraged steady growth. Vegetable gardens also appeared beside many cabins. Potatoes, onions, beans, and squash grew within small fenced plots protected from wandering animals. These crops offered reliable food sources while larger fields slowly developed into productive farmland. Fruit orchards began taking shape as well. Young apple and pear trees were planted across portions of the valley where soil and sunlight combined favorably. Although these trees required several years before producing full harvests, they represented long-term investments in the future of the new settlements. Life in the valley gradually formed patterns that differed greatly from the constant movement of the Oregon Trail. Days were now guided by agricultural routines rather than the slow progress of wagons along dusty roads. Morning chores included feeding livestock, tending gardens, and maintaining tools required for farming. Evenings often ended beside warm fires while rain tapped softly against cabin roofs. Despite the calmer pace, the memory of the long migration remained close. Many settlers still possessed the wagons that had carried them across the plains. These vehicles sometimes stood beside barns or fences, their wooden frames weathered by months of travel. Iron-rimmed wheels leaned quietly against sheds while canvas covers were repurposed as shelter for stored supplies. The wagon had once represented movement toward an uncertain future. Now it stood as a reminder of the road already traveled. Communities within the Willamette Valley slowly expanded as additional migrants continued arriving each year. Paths between farms gradually widened into recognizable roads where horses and wagons moved between neighboring homesteads. Trading posts appeared along these routes, offering basic supplies such as tools, cloth, salt, and iron goods that settlers could not easily produce themselves. These small stores became important gathering places where news from distant regions spread among the growing population. Letters sometimes arrived from relatives who had remained in eastern states. Such correspondence traveled slowly across the continent, often carried by travelers following portions of the same trail used by earlier wagon trains. Receiving a letter months after it had been written created powerful connections between the new settlements and the lives left behind. Religious and social gatherings also played an important role in shaping early community life. Simple churches constructed from logs served not only as places of worship, but also as meeting halls where settlers discussed local concerns, shared information, and organized efforts to assist one another during difficult times. Schoolhouses appeared as families sought education for their children. These small buildings often contained only a single room where students of different ages learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic under the guidance of a teacher appointed by the community. Education carried special importance for families who hoped their children would grow up with opportunities greater than those available during the hardships of frontier migration. Beyond the settlements, the natural landscape of the valley continued shaping daily life. The Willamette River flowed steadily through the region, joined by numerous tributaries descending from the surrounding mountains. These waterways supported salmon runs that occurred each year when fish traveled upstream from the Pacific Ocean to spawn. Fishing quickly became an important seasonal activity. Salmon provided a rich and reliable source of food that could be preserved through drying or smoking for later use. Indigenous communities had relied on these fish for generations, developing sophisticated methods of catching and preparing them. Many settlers gradually learned these techniques through observation and cooperation. Forests surrounding the valley offered additional resources. Timber from Douglas fir, cedar, and spruce trees supplied material for building houses, barns, and fences. Wood also served as fuel during the damp winters when fireplaces burned almost constantly to keep homes warm. Hunting remained part of frontier life as well. Deer, elk, and smaller game animals lived within the forests and foothills surrounding the valley. Although agriculture soon provided the primary food supply, hunting continued supplementing diets during certain seasons. As years passed, the settlements slowly transformed the landscape. Fields expanded across areas that had once been open prairie or woodland. Fences divided farmland into individual claims, while roads connected growing communities. Small towns began emerging along important river crossings or trading routes. Within these towns, blacksmith shops, mills, and general stores formed the early foundations of local economies. Water-powered mills appeared along rivers where flowing currents could turn large wooden wheels used to grind grain into flour. This development allowed farmers to process their wheat more efficiently, supporting both local consumption and trade with distant markets. Transportation within the region gradually improved as roads extended between settlements. Stagecoaches eventually began operating along certain routes, carrying passengers and mail across the valley and connecting communities that had once remained isolated. Although these changes brought increasing stability, the Oregon Trail itself remained an essential pathway for several more years. Each spring, new wagon trains formed far to the east, beginning the long migration toward the same valley that earlier settlers now called home. The arrival of these newcomers brought fresh energy and ideas to the region. They also carried stories from distant places, accounts of cities growing along rivers, railroads expanding westward, and political changes shaping the nation beyond the mountains. Through such stories, the valley remained connected to the wider world. Yet the memory of the trail never disappeared from local identity. Older settlers often recalled the early days when the valley contained only a handful of scattered cabins surrounded by vast wilderness. They remembered the long months spent crossing plains beneath endless skies and climbing mountains where narrow paths barely allowed wagons to pass. These memories became shared history within families and communities. Children born in the valley grew up hearing tales of rivers crossed, deserts endured, and forests entered for the first time after the long migration. For them, the Oregon Trail existed not as a distant legend, but as the real path that had carried their parents across a continent. And so, within the quiet valleys of Oregon, the legacy of that journey continued shaping daily life long after the final wagon wheels had stopped turning.